Hello, students. Topic 9 is going to have us examining the civil rights movement and the reforms of the 1960s. And in this first lesson, which is a long one, I'm going to split into two parts. We're going to examine the struggle for African American civil rights in post-World War II America. Now, to start with, I want to just talk a little bit about two different terms, de jure and de facto segregation. De jure means by law, and this is the kind of segregation you're familiar with from the South with the Jim Crow laws, separating people by race in schools, restaurants, and transportation, in hospitals, and whatever. In some places where you only had one facility, like, for example, one hospital, there was separate days of the week African Americans could go to the hospital. Otherwise, if you were ill, you were not allowed in. It was whites only day. Other places, they had separate facilities built. But in almost all cases, the facility set aside for non-white people, they used colored was the term, was almost always inferior. And the Supreme Court had upheld segregation as constitutional in 1896 with Plessy v. Ferguson, where they ruled that separate but equal does not violate the law or does not violate the constitutional guarantee to equality under the law. De facto segregation is what was more common in the North or in other states that didn't have segregation laws. De facto means by custom or tradition. And this would be largely because of reasons like African Americans facing discrimination in terms of housing and access to jobs, like FHA and the GI Bill, making it harder for African Americans to get loans for homes meant fewer of them lived in the suburbs, for example. And de jure or de facto segregation was also commonly faced by Mexican American and Asian Americans in the West and Southwest. The civil rights movement will really kind of pick up steam after World War II. It takes its roots in somewhat in the Double V campaign, which was the twin victories, victory abroad, victory at home, where African American veterans returning from war to fight for freedom overseas were unwilling to tolerate the discrimination that they were now facing or had been facing at home. Also during World War II, Franklin Roosevelt had issued Executive Order 8802, which, as you recall, banned discrimination in defense industries. So if you were, contracting with the U.S. government, which most industries were, you could not discriminate in hiring based on race. Truman will attempt to kind of push civil rights a little bit further post World War II. He tries to get, after investigating issues of race and voting rights, he tries to get Congress to pass an anti-lynching law as well as laws protecting voting rights for African Americans. But Congress will not do this. Will back off from that. He's left with, the only option of really taking executive orders. And with Executive Order 9981, Truman desegregates the military. So the Korean War, fought in 1950, is the first war the United States fights with an integrated military. In the 1940s, we also see the creation of CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. And CORE is one of these civil rights groups, kind of like the NAACP that we had talked about before, which formed in the early 20th century. CORE was largely focused, at least at first, on northern cities and this de facto segregation in that area. But they will organize a lot of nonviolent protests like sit-ins against discrimination in northern cities. Jackie Robinson, seen in the picture here, is an important figure in this early part of the movement, in that he is he is the first African American to play in the Major League Baseball full time, and he will endure tremendous amounts of threats and racism and comments from fans, other players, etc. And this he paves the way for African Americans and other people of color to enter into other professional sports, major league professional sports. There was already a Negro League in baseball where he and many other black players came from, but the sort of integration of the American sports world. The NAACP in the 1950s really starts to focus its efforts on court cases challenging the constitutionality of discrimination and segregation laws, particularly on the basis of the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed equal protection under the law and due process from states as well as the federal government, and arguing that these laws were violating that. One of their earlier victories in this period is the Supreme Court case of Sweat v. Painter, in which they sue Texas over having separate law schools for African American and white students, and they were clearly unequal, and so the court ruled that this violates the doctrine of separate but equal. But the truly landmark case is going to be 1954's Brown v. Board of Education. The Supreme Court will rule against segregation in public schools, which lays the groundwork for all other desegregation rulings after this, and it completely overturns the early Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal doctrine. What Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP argue in this case is that regardless of the quality of the facilities, separate is inherently unequal, and they used a lot of psychological evidence to show that it was harmful to black children to be separated from the general population. Just inherently, by being put in this situation, it was impressed upon them that you are different and that you are inferior, and it was damaging to the mindset and self-esteem of them. And the court agreed with this decision and forced the integration in the Topeka Board of Education, and we'll see this throughout the country. There will be violent and virulent reactions to this by many whites who were trying to fight to prevent these schools from being integrated, but the Supreme Court does make this ruling in 1954. One of the more famous people from the civil rights movement is Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white passenger in a Montgomery bus, which was by law she was required to do as an African American woman. She was arrested for this. This is going to spark the Montgomery bus boycott, where for over a year African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama will refuse to use the public bus system, seen here walking to work, to church, to shop, wherever, or carpooling as the need be. And this will eventually force the Supreme Court or the city of Montgomery to integrate their busing because of the necessity of how important African American riders were to that. This is also where Martin Luther King really starts to rise to prominence as a spokesperson for the Montgomery bus boycott. And we also start to see, in response actually first to the Brown decision, is the return of the Ku Klux Klan. And the Klan will, of course, threaten and harass these people, actually bombing Martin Luther King's home at one point in response to this bus boycott. The Little Rock Nine is an example of one of the earliest attempts to integrate the Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. They're the first group of students selected to go to that, African American students to go to that school. They will face harassment and threats and sometimes violence from their fellow students and even from teachers. Several of them drop out before graduating and go back to an African American school, or are suspended or kicked out for minor infractions. But some do eventually graduate from there. And this shows some of the conflict between states and federal government as the state government attempted to prevent these kids from integrating the school. The governor of Arkansas sent out the National Guard to block them from going in. Eisenhower, after kind of quibbling over whether it was the federal government's business, eventually sends the 101st Airborne to escort the Little Rock Nine to school every day and to force the state to comply with the federal order. This is in Greensboro, North Carolina. Young people begin organizing sit-ins at segregated lunch counters where they would sit down they targeted first Woolworths, which was a department store with lunch counters there that did not serve black customers. So they would sit down and politely ask to be served. Of course, being refused service, and would remain there until closing time and then return day after day. You can see in this case they're being harassed pretty heartily by other customers in there. And they also faced a lot of harassment and threats and sometimes violence, once again, from the people working there too. This is a picture from one of the buses that was firebombed during a freedom ride. In the Supreme Court case of Boynton v. Virginia, segregation on interstate buses was ruled illegal. So CORE organizes a group of integrated white and black riders to go down in two buses through the Deep South from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, stopping at still segregated busing stations, which was illegal under the federal ruling, and trying to sort of forcibly violate the laws, the segregation laws, by using the facilities there and that sort of thing. This bus was firebombed by an angry group of segregationists. While people were on board, they did escape this. One of the other buses was met at the station by a group of white protesters who beat them severely. And SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that was started in part to support sit-ins, will volunteer to finish out this freedom ride for CORE. President John F. Kennedy, seeing this on television and kind of starting to rely, on black voters. They were some of the people that helped put him into office. He won a lot of support for helping Martin Luther King get released from jail for one of the many times he was put in jail. And it also kind of made us look pretty bad in front of the rest of the world. He will make a deal with Mississippi that they will send their state troops to protect the Freedom Riders. And in exchange, though, JFK agreed not to intervene when Mississippi arrested people for, quote unquote, disturbing the peace. Okay, your assignment then today is Lesson 1's Graphic Organizer, page 1. So Lesson 1 details a lot of the key events, groups, and Supreme Court decisions and laws in this struggle for African American civil rights throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And there's a lot. So we're only going to do the first page to go along with this one, which will take us through, I believe, 1960, 1962, somewhere around there. So do this page front and back. And what you need to do is I list evidence of the cause or the struggle for civil rights for African Americans. Ignore the page number that goes with the book, which you don't have. But in each of these, what I want you to do is to explain how they or it furthered civil rights. And then in the last box, check whether this was actions of private citizens or the federal government, because we're going to compare the role of both in this. So, for example, the Double V campaign, African American veterans were unwilling to accept discrimination after fighting for freedom. And this would be private citizens, because it's not an action of the government, the Supreme Court, the president, or any sort of law. It's ordinary citizens, American veterans, taking a stand. So complete only front and back of the first page. Take a picture and load those up for Google Classroom. Good luck. I love you. Bye-bye.